Okay, here we are live. And we are here at the Somerville Media Center, the great organization that is helping us bring forward these issues of race. And it couldn't be more important to talk about race. I am Diane Wong. I am the host of Let's Talk About Race. I'm here with my co-host, Farrell Saunders, and we both co-produce podcasts, Let's Talk About Race. So we're here today to talk about a topic that has been important in this country from the very beginning. And we're here to say that the time is now. The time is now. We're late, but the time has to be right in this moment to talk about race. So I'm here with a panel of people who have experience in race. So all of us have perspective, and by the end of this program, I'm inviting everybody here and everybody who can see me on our live stream, and even people who can't see me. Get in contact. Let's talk about race. So today we have a panel: Rochelle Cook, Heather Mack, Farrell Saunders, Tina Cabral, and Crystal Chandler. And they're all going to participate with us and talk about race. We're going to have an opportunity to break out into breakout groups, and so you can actually talk more closely. The audience will get a chance to participate. And so I can't say enough. Let's talk about race. I want to move on to Heather. Heather, can you tell us racially, ethnically, can you talk about yourself?
Yep, my name is Heather McCormick. I work here at Somerville Media Center. I run youth programming and the radio program, podcasting programming, which is how I met Diane, who has changed my life in many ways. And I am a white American woman.
A white woman. So it's really important. It's really important that we can say these things. We have a black woman, we have a white woman, and they're unapologetic. This is a white woman. So now tell us about, I mean, we are who we are. So tell us, and it's good for us to articulate who we are. We've got to talk about race. So if we're white, claim it, and let's talk about it. Now, Heather, white young people. Can you talk a little bit about white young people?
Well, I can talk about myself growing up as a white young person in Massachusetts, going to a public school system that was pretty homogenous and very well resourced, very you gotta do really well academically, really well athletically, whatever. I had my own differences. My class experience, I was working poor in this environment, so I had no knowledge of and no modeling of talking about any systems of oppression, right? So we were preparing kids to go off and go to Harvard, but never once modeled or had discussions about race. And that was very intentional. And so I grew up also with my family, being a white family, being like, oh yeah, everyone's the same, the very typical colorblind white racism, and that was the modeling that I had. And in school, we just did not talk about it. Everything was history, everything was in the past. So it really was a critical awakening for me in my late teens, mostly because of my relationships with actual people of color, which I had not, growing up in a pretty very white area. And when I developed those strong friendships, I started to see, oh my goodness, things that I thought were just luck actually seems like white privilege. And they were educating me, and I really pushed myself in college to go deeper on that. And so I was able to take some really great classes and participate and get facilitation training and facilitate some dialogues on whiteness, not just on race, but on whiteness specifically. And I think that's really important. And now, as an educator for young people here in Somerville, some of whom are white, some of whom are black and Latino, and also there's a huge spectrum there, but all different racial and ethnic backgrounds. I think it's so critically important that I can model to them healthy ways to engage on the topic of race.
Talk about whiteness.
Yeah, all right.
Let's
Yeah.
hear about that.
Whiteness is not having to talk about race, right? Whiteness is being, the standard, the default, and never having to be inquisitive. And I think whiteness also, there's this performative white wokeness that we really got to call out. There's a lot of I understand that racism is a problem, but it's like a problem over there, and I'm going to post a link to an article, and then I'm good. And it's like, it doesn't really work like that, right? So as white people, we really need to do the soul searching and get rid of our expectations of being a good white person. You know what I mean? This fragile, behavior of protecting our own egos. And that's something I'm going to work on for the rest of my life. It's a literal ongoing journey, and I have lots of people in my life that I love that keep me in check and push me, and the work that I do that keeps me in check and pushes me. But I could just say, you know what, I can't do the panel, or I'm not really gonna go there, or I'm not gonna have a intense argument with my entire family about Black Lives Matter and cry outside on Christmas, but here I am. So you got to do it. You got to sit in the fire, as Diane would say.
We're going to sit in the fire. We're all going to sit in the fire, because what does that do? That refines us. That takes away the waste and the dross. So we get rid of that. We're going to sit in the fire. Heather, before you finish, about whiteness, what can you say to the white people in the audience and the white people who are watching? What can you say to encourage? How can they participate? Why should they participate in a discussion about race?
I mean, because we all have race, right? White is a race, right? And white is a race that historically has contributed to, systemic oppression against people who, ideally you have relationships, right? It's hard. Sometimes people are so isolated that they really don't have human connections to people from different racial backgrounds, which that's a problem. It's time to look at your friend group and be like, oh crap, you know what I mean? But also it's worth it. It's worth it. The journey is worth it for everybody. I don't wake up every morning with the weight of white guilt on my shoulders. It's a liberating feeling to be able to say, yes, whiteness, white people are racist. I was born and socialized into a society that taught me to be racist. I'm going to be unlearning it for the rest of my life.
And so are we all.
Right.
We all who grew up in the United States of America, we all have a white kind of belief. We're white supremacists.
Yeah.
How do we live and have our being in a society that's white supremacist without believing in some of that? All of us. So here we've got Pharoah Saunders, and Pharoah Saunders, I said, is the co-host and the co-producer of Let's Talk About Race that we started in November 2017. And so Pharoah, can you self-identify?
I would self-identify as an African-American black man.
Here he is, unconfused. It's so helpful. So, and so even though Pharoah has ancestry, multiracial ancestry, he grew up as a black man, and he understands what it means to be a black man in America and to state that clearly. So, Pharoah, what are some of the issues? You're really interested in the history, and you do a lot of research.
Yeah.
So what are some of the issues around education, and especially for black young people? Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, well, generally what I try to contribute to the show is sort of my input in terms of viewing things through historical or philosophical lenses. So I think that there's generally two ways in which history plays a big role in these sorts of things. And this may be a little bit of a generalization, but I usually try to focus it on one of these two things, which is one, either having a proper understanding of history. There often can be lots of biases as well as just misinformation that people can be raised with, and it can be very difficult to unlearn, or even if they are factually unlearned, the spirit of that same sort of initial understanding.
Like white supremacy.
Exactly.
Hard.
Even if you might learn something, technically later maybe different, you're still raised with this sort of system, and so it would still instill these sorts of values in someone, even if they intellectually unlearn something. And beside that, it's also understanding the importance of history. So a lot of people might have a very good textbook understanding of history, but might not understand the real importance of what roles that could play in their lives currently, right? Like someone might say, like this is something that people say all the time, like Heather just mentioned it recently, is you might learn about something, but then you'll say, oh, it's in the past. That doesn't affect me now, that doesn't affect you now. It's like, they're dead. That can't matter now because we're alive. And that's just a very short-sighted understanding of the sorts of roles that these factors can play in the current day.
What are some of the roles that the factors play?
Well, there's a lot, but one that I was going to talk about in some detail today is specifically the role of how you not exactly self-identify, but how you view yourself in the lens of history. So if you are consistently researching things, you're consistently taught things that only specify and only focus on a specific subset that most people in the world don't fall under, then you'll have a very skewed sense. Well, for example, if you only view things in a Western context of history, and I think there's reasons for that some of them make sense, but if you only view things through literally only one subtext of history, and you don't fall under that demographic, then you'll have a very consistent sense of confusion and loss in terms of where you fit into society and where your people came from in a sort of greater long-term sense.
So as a black man, what kind of an education, for black people, for black young people, black youth, what do they need? What do you suggest?
I think that a lot of things are needed, and specificity to what I was just saying, I think that understanding that your story doesn't start with slavery is important, because I feel like that's something that any person from the African diaspora can relate to if they're raised in a Western affected country. Well, every country's Western affected, but specifically like the United States, the Caribbean, South America, etc. You read that that's where your story starts, right? Your story starts with slavery, and then it goes up to the modern day, and that gives you a very specific sense of where you think your people came from. And not only you, and this is why it affects non-black people as well, if your education on black history says black people's story starts with slavery, then that will affect how they see black people as well. And so I think it's really important, especially for black people, though I'd say for everyone, to understand that that isn't true, that there is a very rich and complex history of where black civilization comes from. Every European, regardless of their specific ethnicity, knows about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. I think it's important for black people to know things about the Songhai Empire, the Mali Empire, the Zulu kingdoms, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that if you have these sorts of understandings of the great things that these civilizations have accomplished, then you would understand that not only do your people come from somewhere just like everyone else, it's not like a void, that you would have a sense of pride in where you come from, like people should have.
And so what other kinds of things could black young people, what do they need?
Well, unfortunately, this isn't something that is taught early on in any sort of standard education system, so I think that there's some things that you can do to self-educate about that. I think fostering a sense of the importance of self-education is an important thing for everyone in general. So I think that that's always a good place to start. I think that if you have these questions, it's important to understand that you have most likely the tools or the potential time to research these things and learn more about these topics.
So what about the teachers that they come into contact with? How important are role models?
I think that role models are incredibly important. I think that that is something that can be difficult. I think that if you feel as though you can't relate on a personal level to your educators or immediate role models in that sense, besides like your parents, for example, then you might not be able to closely associate enough in a way in which you could open up about how you are potentially wondering about these things. You might just feel as though it is your duty to assimilate to your role models or your peers, and thus asking these questions would be going out of line of those things. And so having role models, regardless of what background they are, explain that it is not only normal, but encourage that it's important to ask these sorts of things and understand these sorts of things would be a great addition to this sort of difficult task that young people have to go through.
So then you mean that if you're a black young person in school and all over the place, that having black people that look like you, people that maybe feel some of the same things that you feel, so that then you can grow up feeling what?
I think that that's definitely a big part of it, or even if they aren't black, just making it clear that it's important to know about your history as a black person. But if you can directly relate, in a sense, and I definitely think that there is a unmatchable quality in terms of being able to directly relate to someone like that. So I think, minorities having role models they can directly relate to on a racial level can also be very helpful for them. But in terms of what that leads them to create or leads them to understand, I think what that is understanding a sense of belonging in a historical sense, not that you just appeared on the timeline somewhere without prior explanation, unlike all the people that you read about, but a sense of cosmic belonging almost.
Thank you. Tina Cabral, could you self-identify racially, ethnically?
Self-identify as a black American woman. I am first generation from the Cape Verde Islands. Both my parents hail from Cape Verde. And I grew up in Cambridge, born and raised in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Cambridge being a very diverse melting pot, we never saw each other by color or religion or anything of the sort. It was just all a very kind of mixed, diverse community. And so I almost feel like it was a privilege growing up in Cambridge, because a lot of the diversity buzzwords that came forth in years later, it was very natural for us. It was very natural to have a person of any hue, any religion, and any background, including socioeconomic background. So I feel very privileged to come from that standpoint and see everybody really in terms of character and what you bring to the table. Now that may not be, and I am clear in understanding that may not be the way that I am always perceived. I may be perceived by the color of my skin, in that I may be too light or too dark to fit in a certain category. But again, growing up in Cambridge, I've always been aware of that, and I've always been true to myself. And in growing up with both very strong mother and grandmother, I've been able to be comfortable in the skin that I am, embrace my ethnicity as a Cape Verdean American in the culture, in the language, in the food, in the music, and everything. And in terms of my race as well, being true to my race, no matter how light or how dark, we as a people, as Cape Verdean descent, we come in all hues, and we embrace our culture. So growing up in Cambridge, I had a lot of African American friends. I had a lot of white American friends and friends of all different backgrounds. But I've always identified with being a black woman in America, and of course identifying with the issues that comes along with that as well. So growing up in my household with a Cape Verdean mother who spoke English as well, and a grandmother who spoke no English, I had to figure out a lot of sort of things about race myself, because in the household it wasn't taught. It was just your ethnicity is this, and take people as such. And race wasn't really an issue. It wasn't until kind of getting into school and kind of in the world that you kind of learn about race and race relations, because back in Cape Verde, it's all about culture. And no matter, again, how dark or how light you are, you speak the language, you eat a little cachupa, and you're good. You're part of the culture. You know, even as a white person, there are many white people who have migrated to Cape Verde and learned to speak the language and are embraced as the natives. So it's really a difference between ethnicity and race, and I've had to kind of merge both worlds, sometimes under difficult circumstances.
So Tina, we're going to talk with Tina about, we have immigrant issues in the United States. We're seeing that all the time. And so we've always, I mean, we're a country of immigrants, but in the past, white immigrants were not, I mean, there are issues clearly with all groups of immigrants, but in my growing up, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was the Hungarian Revolution at the time, and so I saw an embrace of the Hungarian refugees, and then I saw the Hungarian refugees turn around and not want me to be around. I remember getting on a bus one time, 5 years old, I remember this. This is how we remember things. This is how things get imprinted in our minds. I'm 5 years old, I get on the bus with my mother, and we're walking in through the bus. It was kind of crowded. I went to sit down next to what I really believe was a Hungarian refugee. They were everywhere. And she gave me the dirtiest look, and she shrunk away. And I knew by her body language, she did not want me to sit next to her. So I just kept walking. And that's how it happens. It doesn't have to happen. She didn't call me a nigger. She didn't say, nigger, girl, don't come over here and sit next to me. That's the South. She's a Hungarian refugee. What she learned was stay away from those black people. So now, Tina, what about Cape Verdeans and black Americans? What's going on with that? I've heard different things.
Right. It's a very interesting relationship. It's an evolving relationship, and it continues to be so. Again, I come from a different standpoint. When I was growing up in Cambridge at that time, there weren't too many Cape Verdeans or Cape Verdean Americans at that time. Now there's a lot. There's about actually 300,000 plus in the country right now, and there wasn't that many back then.
That's not a lot.
That's not a lot at all. And it's
I
even
thought you were
fewer
gonna say
back in
Boston.
Cape Verde. They're mostly in the New England area. And so it varies. It depends on who you ask. If you ask me, I'll say I'm black. If you ask another Cape Verdean who could be darker skinned than me, they will say that they're Cape Verdean and they're not black at all. Some Cape Verdeans who were particularly born under the Portuguese flag before 1975, when it became independent, will more identify with Portuguese and being Portugal, being of Portuguese descent. Of course, we're a mixed population, but sort of gravitating more toward the European influence and not embracing the African influence.
I see that a lot. And what do you think is causing that? Let's get into why is the push away of African Americans and the embrace of the enslavers?
Well, I see a lot of the young folk, the young folk of the Cape Verdean community getting caught up in this dilemma, in that they self-identify as black Americans. They were born here and they are black, of African descent. However, the parents disencourage that identity that they make with the black Americans. So they're caught up in the dilemma. It often brings confusion and a feeling of not belonging, which could result in forms of looking for connections in other places and not so great places, leading to at-risk behavior and juvenile crime violence, and statistics have shown that. And I have a great example. There are Cape Verdeans who will look at a person who may be more darker skinned and say, okay, that person is black. And then you'll see another person who's fair skinned and say that person is white, when they're both actually black. Now, this is where a lot of the disparity comes within the Cape Verdean community in terms of, first, not having an internal dialogue of internalized racism, which is preventing people from embracing their identity, self-identity, and which leads to society identifying who you are. And that's the last thing that you want, because that could leave that could leave a person very confused and disconnected with society. So it's important to embrace for the households to be on the same page, and that's learning, knowing your history.
And again, history.
Again, history is
Knowing your
a very important thing, is learning history. There are Cape Verdean, the older generation, who know how to recite rosaries from the Bible, or rosaries, and don't know about their African heritage. You know, and that was more under the Portuguese rule. Now, you know, the younger folk and post-colonization know more about the history, but there's still a lot of unpacking that needs to be done. And so, going back to my example, when you might have a Cape Verdean of an older generation who looks at a fairer skin or a darker skin and says one is black and one is white, but you have, we'll say, a white American who says, oh, they're both black. Well, that doesn't make sense, because obviously the white American gets it, and you don't even get it within your own community. So that leaves us further behind.
We struggle.
And we need to continuously unpack that before we come to the table with the white community and everybody as a whole to have a bigger conversation.
Yes. We're not going to get to the kumbaya moment.
Yeah.
That'll come. But that has to come. First, we have to understand, where are we and how did we get here?
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about today. So in terms of the history, clearly understanding our own racial history, but also understanding white supremacy. We live in a white supremacist society. The country was built on that, developed to be that, and there's never been an intervention. There's never been anything that said, here's the line in the sand. We know what white supremacy is, and we choose not to be that. We're still a white supremacist society. We pretend like we aren't, but we are. So let's embrace the white supremacy society that we have, and then start to unpack that. Crystal. Thank you, Tina. Crystal Chandler. So Crystal, could you self-identify racially, ethnically?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I acknowledge that race is a social construct, but I identify as a black woman, but also a Barbadian American, because my family is from the island of Barbados, so I do have, like, the Caribbean, you know, like, not even, I wouldn't say ancestry. My dad's straight from Barbados. My mom's from England. My grandparents are all from Barbados, so I definitely have deep roots, like, in the Caribbean, for sure.
And so how does that play itself out in the middle of an America that kind of wants to see itself as black, white, when they look at black people and white people?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll talk to that question in terms of, like, what it meant interacting with other black people and what it meant interacting with white people or just non-black people. In terms of black Americans, I'll say growing up, it was very much instilled in me that we're different, that we're not black Americans. And so I grew up, you know, uninformed with that sentiment, thinking that there was something, like, strangely and vastly different from, you know, black Caribbean people and black Americans. Yes, like, culturally we have a lot of differences, but truly we're a lot more similar than we think. And so we grew up kind of with this sentiment of, well, we're from the Caribbean, so, like, we're not them, right? So we're, like, a little bit higher up. And that was, like, directly from my grandmother coming here, and really instilling that in me, like, you know, growing up with her. And I think in terms of what it meant dealing with white people, I was black, you know, like, they didn't know where in the world Barbados was. And even till this day, they're like, Bahamas, or I'll say, like, I'm Bayesian, right? Because that's what we are, we're Bayesian. They're like, Beijing, like, in China. So, so it was, like, a really different experience that I had, because I'm over here trying to geographically show, you know, white people where Barbados is, and over here with black Americans. Sometimes it was the same, too, but it was also this, like, disassociation, because it was instilled from me from a young age that we were not Black Americans. And so I grew up literally saying that, like, you know, I'm Black, but I'm not Black American, or I'm Barbadian, I'm not African American, right? And it's only over the years that you get knowledge and, you know, you have more interactions that you realize, like, how absurd, like, that sentiment is. And, you know, it's one of those things, I think everyone said, it's all about, like, unpacking what you learned and figuring out how you can move forward in order to, like, you know, essentially just be a better person. So, yeah, that was kind of, like, my instilling and, like, upbringing regarding, like, being a Barbadian American and trying to figure out where I fit in terms of Blackness and Black Americanness. And, you know, I wasn't American, but I wasn't, you know, like, Black American per se, because there were certain, like, cultural differences in terms of, like, coming from the South. That's what I was taught. Like, Black American meant you came from the South, and I was like, well, okay, we don't really, like, you know, identify with, you know, the Southern culture, but we don't really identify with the American culture. It was, like, so confusing. So I think racially and ethnically, like, this journey has been nothing less than a roller coaster. Yeah.
So this is great, and the reason that this is really important, not just because the topic is let's talk about race, we're talking about race, but also we're starting to see that the issues aren't just with white people. The issues we've got in the Black community, as you can see, just talking to a couple of people here, you can see that we're struggling. And I think that the main reason that we struggle, we don't bring this topic up. Colorism is big, and also people who say, I don't see race. I mean, come on. Come on. The only way you can not see, and even if you don't see, if you're not sighted, you're blind, you find other ways to see race. You hear a voice, and you can, and Americans, we can make tiny little distinctions. I've been watching myself to see, what do I see? In a glance, I can see, and I can tell, I can see what, in my opinion, this is all perspective. In my perspective, I see race, I see gender, I probably want to work in class. I can look at certainly age. So I see all that in a glance, less than a second of looking at anybody. And other Americans do the same thing. So take the blinders off. We see race, and it's not just, and we see color, and we see certainly class, because we have economic discrimination. That's called capitalism. That's the society we live in. We're a white supremacist society, and we believe in capitalism. So we like having poor people, because then we can say, we're better than they are. We're a competitive society, we stratify, and so we've got a lot to talk about race. We can talk about race for days and days and days, and then we can sit in the fire. We can burn up that stuff. But until we talk about it, we don't even, until we talk, I'll tell a quick story. I was at a university in Oregon, where I was working there, and some issue happened in this university. And so the faculty all had to get together with the student. You know, you have all these universities have these big group meetings. And so so after this was all over, I went around and I was interviewing the faculty to see, you know, what was going on, how they felt about it. And one faculty member said that in that meeting, for the first time, it was a man, he had to get up and talk about race. And he said when he got up to speak about race, the words coming out of his mouth, he didn't even believe them himself. He didn't even recognize that. And he said, I could hear my mother speaking. So because he's a faculty member, he had to say something. And when he started to talk about race, which was a topic he didn't usually talk about, the stuff that's inside of us is poison. So, and we need to get it out, and we need to talk about it. So, Crystal, the media, you're a member of the media, a star. Crystal's a media star.
Yeah.
And she's good at what she does.
Thank
So,
you.
Crystal, tell us about how's the media impacts all of this.
Yeah, totally. The media does an excellent job at reinforcing all the terrible things. I will be absolutely transparent about that, and I've worked in a different array of media, including most recently working on a feature film.
The Women, right? Or
Yeah, Little Women. Yeah, I worked on Little Women that was filming here in Boston, and starting out my journey really doing news and hard news, I see the stories that make it to, the 6 o'clock news, to, the morning news, like the 7 a.m. news. And in terms of what that looks like for people of color and specifically Black people, it's not always great, right? It's usually, they always teach us, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So if there's a shooting, let's talk about it, right? Another thing too, even though it's a positive thing, is kind of like that triumph story. Like, we overcame, right? And so that kind of always reinforces that narrative. I think kind of like what Farah was talking about, that, if you go back and talking about our story started with slavery, we overcame slavery, right? And so you fast forward to today, and we're still always talking about these triumph stories. And it's really great, but at the same time, we're more dynamic than just those two sides. I also have worked in television as well, like regular schmegular television, and just kind of seeing the different ways in which, the writers in the room, what they're kind of thinking about when they're writing, TV shows, like our favorite TV shows. Who are the people that are casting them? It gets really complicated, that's for sure. And a lot of times those people don't look like me, per se. And moving forward into, kind of feature film, the one that I just worked on. I mean, Grant Little Women is set in a year when we weren't even free. Let's be for real. And even though quote unquote slavery was over, we were not free. And I can say, wholeheartedly, that was accurate. But even just looking at how you piece together a film like that, who's involved with, again, going back to the casting of the people, going back to even lunch tables, right? At work when we're talking about movies and things like that. That's all we do all day, right? We're creating movies and we talk about movies, but even at in conversations with my coworkers, we're not talking about Black movies per se, right? Unless they're the top tier Black movies that everyone's talking about. And so for me, there's kind of been this weird navigation of, I want to get back to my roots of being, and I haven't left it per se, but I do want to not steer away from my roots of being kind of like what Rochelle does, where it's I do documentaries. I'm involved in a prison documentary right now and dismantling what it means, in terms of the prison industrial complex. That's really where my heart is, in terms of, unpacking and unveiling and really getting these narratives out there that are not in mainstream media. That's really where my heart is, but it's also having to navigate within this ridiculous system of, like you said, capitalism and the media and who owns the media, and it's a small group of people, and it's really terrible because it's a small group of people, it's a small group of corporations that put out the mass media, that tell us how we look about, how we talk about race and things like that. And this is for everyone, right? Not just Black people. They put out narratives about white people, about immigrants, about, wherever you're from. And so I think the media has a very, very, very big role in how we talk about race. And we're moving forward in terms of, being better about it, but we have a really long way to go, because I think if you close your eyes and think about your favorite TV show or a movie that you saw growing up, right, there's something that you took from that you still remember today, good, bad, or indifferent. So the media has a really big role, and sometimes they're not always responsible, for the narratives that they put out there.
When you say that, what I think about, I remember the cartoons. Mm-hmm. You could always tell that it was supposed to be a Black character because they would talk in some kind of a Black jive way. And so, and those were the cartoons we would plop our kids in front of, hour after hour of absorbing that racist, vile nonsense, and we haven't unpacked that. So let's talk about police brutality. What's going on? I mean, why is that going on in the United States of America? Why do we know that we're killing black people, black men in particular, because the police are afraid as soon as they see the color of their skin, and they shoot them and they kill them, and we know that, and we haven't done anything about it. What's going on with police brutality?
Well, I don't think that policemen are afraid of black people. There's nothing to be afraid of when you see a black person. When these policemen are killing these men are not armed. There's nothing to be afraid of. If anybody should be afraid, it should be the black man, because he's the one that doesn't have the gun, and the cop is the one that has the gun, and he has all his, his police posse with him with guns. So they're not afraid. I don't buy that for a minute. That's what they say to try to get themselves out of it. But they're victimizing these black men. I think a lot of times what's happening is they're going into, and you mentioned class. They're going into neighborhoods that have poor people, and these people do not have protection. So they think that they can go into these neighborhoods and treat people any old kind of way that they want, and they know that they can get away with it because historically policemen have always gotten away with it. Like we saw with Laquan McDonald, the cop, he got only, I believe, 8 years, but I know that he's probably only going to do 3 years. Of course, the other cops, they got off. So they get away with it. They know that they will get away with it. They know that black people, especially poor black people, do not have protection, and they won't go to jail. They won't be criticized by their white peers. Everybody's pro-Cabo. Cops are so good. It's like they're human beings. And the way that the policemen started, it was basically like slavery patrol.
Slave patrols.
Slave patrols,
And
yeah.
and it continues till today.
Yeah, so they didn't even start as people to defend and protect. That's not even how they started. They started as people to basically torture black people. So it's just something that continues to this day. And I actually made a film about it called Wrath City because
WRATH, Wrath.
yes, because I was actually at a writing workshop in Boston, and in 2016, when all these police killings were happening on TV, somebody else had created this story on these clowns that were being oppressed, and I was the only black woman in the room. Everybody went around and talked about, the fact that, I relate to this because I think it speaks to the LGBTQ community. And I was the last to speak, and I was like, actually, no, I think that this is speaking to all these black people that are getting killed by these cops on television. And all the white people were silent, and they just went back to talking about how, gay people are violated and this and that. And they didn't go back to what I was talking about. So I think a lot of times I want to just say, particularly if you are a liberal and you're outraged when it comes to people that are violated because of their sexual orientation, if you're outraged when white women are violated, you're outraged about all this you're outraged over illegal immigrants. You need to also be outraged when black people are getting killed too. I'm tired of bringing it up and people just not caring and just ignoring it. Our lives matter too, and that's why she's wearing that Black Lives Matter shirt. Our lives matter too. Be outraged when it comes to us too, because we matter too, just like gay people, white women, and illegal immigrants. And I want to see more liberals speaking up for us, because I don't see that.
Not only do our lives matter, but we have a big contribution to make. And if we weren't struggling all the time to get the foot off of our neck, we could be struggling to bring forward the gifts that we all are. We all have a gift. Let's bring those gifts out. Now that is a question for the whole panel. What about this police brutality?
I mean, Rochelle just said a lot. I mean, I was going to say, the police system in the United States is built out of the intent of protecting white wealth, particularly white male property owners' wealth, and always has been. And so when people say, oh, the system's not working, it's working exactly as it was intended to, unfortunately. And that's on all of our conscience, right? That is something that, you know, and I completely agree, right? It's like you see the Facebook posts about, you know, or the Twitter posts about you know, certain topics and issues coming up. And, you know, there's a lot of white silence when it comes to police brutality. Because it doesn't touch us, right? It doesn't have to, right? Unless maybe we work with young Black people who, you know, obviously I've worked with, you know, been an educator for 10 years and had a lot of my young people, you know, experience significant negative interactions with police. I've luckily never lost any of my young people, but I also recognize the reality that I could, and that, you know, it is on me, you know, at the protests, and I've been down to some of the protests. I remember I think it was a Freddie Gray protest, and we all marched down to the South Bay Correctional, and we were, you know, it was white people to the front, and that's a big thing here. Like, a big thing I just want to keep saying is white people to the front. So if we're at a protest, but also just, you know.
What does that mean?
It means, like, we need to put ourselves on the front line. We need to protect, right? We need to use our privilege to protect people who don't have our privilege, right?
You mean because if white people
I'll
are
get
on
the benefit
front,
of the doubt.
they may not
Right.
be. They may
I'm not going to
get
get beaten.
beat up. Okay, so you're
Right.
acting
So
as protection.
physically, but also,
Okay.
you know, spiritually, politically, in our work, white people need to be the first people to speak out and to say and to risk the uncomfortable conversations. Which, God, that's not a risk. Like, losing your life is a risk. That's not a risk. Anyway, yeah.
So just go ahead to the panel speak. We've only got about 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think that I definitely agree with a lot of what you said. I think that's very true, and I think a lot of it can be seen specifically in how some of these officers will react after the fact, and that they behave in a way that suggests that they know that they could have just gotten away with it. There was no necessity to treat this event with the tact that someone of their position should theoretically have to treat it. I think that it's definitely a multifaceted thing. I do think personally that some of them do act out of fear, and you're completely right that they shouldn't be afraid. It doesn't make any sense. They're the one armed with the deadly weapon. They're oftentimes attacking someone who not only isn't armed, but is in no physical position to do anything at all, right? But, you know, lots of people have irrational fears.
Like
you know,
tied up with their hands behind their
no,
back.
sure. Like, people will freak out to see a spider. That's irrational. People freak out to see a rat. That's irrational. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because of the way the media puts on this fear campaign, basically, against Black people, especially Black men, about, like, this little super predator narrative. Like, they're going to leap across the room unarmed and beat you to death with their bare hands before you can draw a sidearm. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely irrational, but I think that some people believe it. And they are people, right? You know, police officers are people. I think that there's obviously, with all people, multiple range of how they feel about it. I think some act out of malicious intent for whatever motivation that may be. I think some are, you know, just bombarded with that sort of insane, irrational fear image and react out of desperation of that. And I do think that someone that would, like, intellectually and emotionally react to something that way should not be allowed to have a position like that. I think that's ridiculous. The entire point of that position is that you should have courage in the face of things like that, so that's insane to me. But the point is that I think that it is a complicated issue, and I think that there definitely is tons of truth to be spoken to both of those things, and both of those are massive issues. Obviously, someone that, you know, reacts with, you know, lethal violence in the face of something like that that's horrific, and obviously shouldn't be in a position like that, and should face grave repercussions for that. But someone who, you know, would react with lethal violence out of fear is no better. That's not like a justification. It's just understanding the issue deeper, but that doesn't make them any better. That doesn't, you know, like alleviate any of the guilt off of their shoulders. Then they still should be punished for that, because it's, you know, it's still murder, regardless of what your intent was.
Anybody else? We have 1 minute.
I'll just say real quick, you know, I kind of second a lot of what everyone said. In terms of Black Lives Matter and police brutality, first of all, I do want to say that there's going to be a march on Monday. So I think Understanding that the movement doesn't stop is a really big thing, but also that agreed, like the media, again, does an excellent job at reinforcing these terrible narratives. And that's where a lot of these quote unquote fears come from, because we consume the media on a daily basis, in not just television, magazines, podcasts, you name it. And so I do, again, like the media has a huge responsibility in that, because that is what we consume on a daily basis. Imagine your day without any media, no social media, no television, no magazine, no newspaper, nothing.
Oh my
right?
God, just ourselves?
That's what I'm saying. So how would you, exactly, right? Yourselves and the people around you. Imagine how different the narratives that you ingest every day would change.
And just to add to that, that negative perception of black men or black Americans goes out beyond the boundaries of our country and goes to, for example, Cape Verde, since I'm Cape Verdean. And that contributes a lot to the perception of black Americans or black men, and why there may be a discouragement to identify as a black American and hold on to the ethnicity, and learning the hard way about your race.
We're at the end of our time, and this has been very productive. I'm very happy that you're all here. Thank you for coming. You're going to have an opportunity to participate. We do a show, me and Farrell, every Thursday from 7 to 8. It's called Let's Talk About Race. We bring people on, they can talk about whatever they want in terms of race, whatever your perspective is. In this country, we didn't have a movement like South Africa, reconciliation. We need one. We're going to start here. This is our grassroots effort. We are announcing this is a national campaign to talk about race, starting right here, Somerville, Massachusetts. This is the first of 4 events. 2 events will be in the community, as yet to be determined. The last event, this is for Martin Luther King Day. The last event will be on Juneteenth, an important Emancipation Day in Black history. And that will be also here with a panel discussion. Our talk today was about where are we? Where are we? Where are we? The talk on the Juneteenth will be, where do we go from here? So we need everybody to participate. And this doesn't happen just by happenstance. This happens because the Somerville Media Center stepped up and is willing and actually encourages me. So thank you, Somerville Media Center. And also the Somerville Arts Council supported this financially. We need financial support. We've got all of this crew behind us. We've got people on cameras. Thank all of the crew for being here. And we've got the Massachusetts Cultural Council. They put up money. We need money.
Yeah.
We're in the United States of America. To do these things, we have to be supported. We need money. We need your support to come on the show. Let's talk about race. Thank you.
Right. So ideally there will be pizza outside waiting for us, but I think that was who was calling my phone the whole time. Right? So